Celeste Morrison slammed on the brakes so hard her coffee spilled across the dashboard. The roadside diner she had bought just 1 week ago was gone. In its place stood a military-style checkpoint with concrete barriers, razor wire, and security personnel in protective gear. A sign read, "Authorized personnel only, Blackwood Security Solutions." Her hands trembled as she pulled out the property deed from her glove compartment. The same deed she had signed with her life savings. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to build something for Dylan. But now, uniformed men with equipment were treating her investment like a restricted government facility. One guard was already walking toward her dusty Honda, his hand resting on his equipment belt. She had no idea how her simple roadside diner had become a fortress overnight. Celeste had driven 300 miles from Albuquerque with renovation supplies in her back seat and hope in her heart. The rundown diner on Highway 287 had seemed like destiny when she found the listing online. For $47,000, she could own a piece of the American West and finally escape her cramped apartment where Dylan studied by lamplight because the overhead fixture had been broken for months. She was a certified public accountant who understood numbers and risk, but this purchase felt different. It felt like courage. The checkpoint that now occupied her property looked like something from a war zone. Concrete barriers formed a maze leading to a heavily fortified booth where multiple guards checked identification. Military-style vehicles were parked in what used to be the diner's gravel lot. The original building was still there, but metal sheeting covered all the windows, and satellite equipment sprouted from the roof like mechanical flowers. A guard in black tactical gear approached her car, his face hidden behind reflective sunglasses. His nameplate read, Torres. Behind him, she could see at least 6 more armed personnel moving with practiced precision around the perimeter. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to turn around immediately," Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Celeste rolled down her window, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm sorry, but there's been some mistake. I own this property. I have the deed right here." Torres glanced at the paperwork she held out, but didn't take it. "Ma'am, this facility is under federal security contract. I'm going to need you to exit the area now." "Federal contract?" Celeste's voice cracked. "I bought this place fair and square. There's no way the federal government can just take private property without due process." Torres spoke into his radio, words she couldn't quite catch. Within seconds, 2 more guards approached her vehicle. One carried what looked like a device for checking license plates. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to turn your vehicle around and leave this area immediately." "This is a matter of national security." Celeste looked past the guards at her diner, now transformed into something she didn't recognize. Her entire future, Dylan's college fund, everything she had worked for was sitting behind those concrete barriers. But as more guards emerged from the building, she realized she was outmatched. Whatever was happening here was bigger than a simple property dispute. She put the car in reverse, but her mind was already racing ahead. Someone had stolen her dream, and she was going to find out exactly who was responsible for turning her roadside diner into a fortress. Celeste drove 15 miles to the nearest town before pulling into a gas station parking lot, her hands still shaking. She called Dylan first, trying to keep the panic out of her voice as she explained that the renovation trip would be delayed. Her 16-year-old son had been so excited about their new business venture, already planning how he would help run the diner after school. Now she had to figure out how to tell him their entire future had vanished behind concrete barriers and armed guards. The Roswell County Clerk's office was a squat adobe building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Celeste waited 40 minutes to see a clerk, clutching her property deed and purchase documents like a lifeline. When her number was finally called, she approached the counter with desperate hope. "I need to verify property ownership," she told the clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. "Someone is claiming my property belongs to the federal government." The clerk typed Celeste's information into an ancient computer system, frowning at the screen. "Ma'am, according to our records, the property at 247 Highway 287 was sold to Blackwood Security Solutions 3 days ago. The sale was processed through an emergency federal acquisition." Celeste felt her stomach drop. "That's impossible. I bought that property a week ago. Here's my deed." The woman examined Celeste's paperwork carefully, then checked her computer again. "I'm seeing 2 conflicting records here. Your purchase is dated 7 days ago, but there's a federal override dated 3 days ago." This kind of situation requires legal resolution. The property is currently under disputed ownership status. What does that mean exactly? It means nobody can take possession until the courts sort it out. But the federal claim takes temporary precedence for security purposes. Celeste's mind reeled. 3 days ago, she had been at work, processing tax returns and dreaming about her new life. How could the government seize property that she legally owned? And why would they want a rundown roadside diner badly enough to override private ownership? Back in her car, she called the number on her purchase contract. James Crawford, the real estate agent who had handled the sale, answered on the first ring. "Mr. Crawford, this is Celeste Morrison. I need to understand what happened to my property on Highway 287. There was a long pause. "Ms. Morrison, I think you should know that I've been advised not to discuss that transaction anymore. My lawyer says it's now a matter of national security." "National security? It's a roadside diner." "Ma'am, all I can tell you is that sometimes properties are more valuable than they appear. That diner sits on strategically important land. I suggest you contact a lawyer who specializes in federal property disputes." Crawford hung up before she could ask another question. Celeste sat in her car, staring at the phone. Strategically important land? The diner was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrub brush and highway. The only thing special about the location was that it was cheap enough for a single mother to afford. She pulled out her laptop and started researching Blackwood Security Solutions. What she found made her blood run cold. Blackwood wasn't just a security company. They were military contractors specializing in classified government operations, with connections that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Her phone rang, and she didn't recognize the number. The voice on the phone was gravelly, like someone who had smoked for decades. "Ms. Morrison, my name is Frank Garrett. I used to own the land your diner sits on. Before I sold it to the previous owner 15 years ago. We need to talk." Celeste gripped the phone tighter. "Mr. Garrett, I'm dealing with some kind of federal takeover of my property. Do you know anything about why the government would want that land?" "Not over the phone," Garrett said quickly. "Ed, meet me at the Silver Dollar Cafe in Roswell. 1 hour. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going. These people don't play games." The line went dead before Celeste could ask any more questions. She sat in her car for several minutes, debating whether to trust a stranger who seemed to know more about her situation than she did. But with her entire life savings tied up in a property she couldn't access, she didn't have many options. The Silver Dollar Cafe turned out to be a truck stop diner filled with long-haul drivers and local ranchers. Frank Garrett was easy to spot, a weathered man in his 70s sitting alone in a corner booth, wearing a cowboy hat that had seen better days. His eyes constantly scanned the room, as if he expected trouble to walk through the door at any moment. "You're younger than I expected," he said, as Celeste slid into the booth across from him. "That might work in your favor, or it might get you killed." Celeste felt a chill run down her spine. "Mr. Garrett, what exactly is happening to my property?" Garrett leaned forward, lowering his voice. 20 years ago, I discovered something while digging a well on that land. Something the government very much wanted to keep secret. I made the mistake of asking questions, and they made my life hell until I sold and moved away." "What did you find?" "Evidence of illegal dumping. Barrels and barrels of chemical waste buried in the desert behind where your diner sits. Stuff that would make the ground toxic for generations if it ever leaked. The company responsible had government contracts, and some very powerful people wanted that evidence to disappear." Celeste's mind raced. "So they're using the checkpoint to keep people away from the contaminated area?" "That's my guess. But here's the thing. I kept copies of everything I found. Photos, soil samples, documents. I've been waiting 20 years for someone with legal claim to that property to come forward." Garrett pulled a manila envelope from his jacket. "This contains enough evidence to prove massive environmental violations and government cover-ups. But using it means going up against people who have already proven they'll destroy lives to protect their secrets." Celeste stared at the envelope. Inside was either her salvation or her destruction. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I'm dying of cancer, probably from exposure to whatever they buried out there. I've got maybe 6 months left, and I want those responsible to pay before I'm gone." "You're the first person in 2 decades with legal standing to fight back." A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot outside. Garrett noticed it immediately, his face going pale. "We need to leave. Now, take the back exit and don't go home tonight. They're watching you." Celeste grabbed the envelope as Garrett stood up, throwing money on the table. Through the window she could see two men in dark suits getting out of the SUV. They moved with the same precision she had seen at the checkpoint. "How do I contact you?" she asked. But Frank Garrett was already walking toward the back of the diner, his shoulders hunched with fear and 20 years of carrying dangerous secrets. Celeste drove for 2 hours on back roads before finally stopping at a roadside motel 30 miles outside Artesia. She paid cash for a room and parked her Honda behind the building where it couldn't be seen from the highway. Only then did she dare to open Frank Garrett's manila envelope. The contents made her stomach turn. Photographs showed dozens of chemical barrels partially buried in desert sand, many of them corroded and leaking dark substances into the ground. Laboratory reports documented dangerous levels of industrial solvents, heavy metals, and compounds she had never heard of. Most disturbing were the government memos discussing the need to contain the situation and minimize exposure liability. One document caught her attention immediately. It was a contract between Meridian Chemical Corporation and the Department of Defense, dated 23 years ago. The contract authorized Meridian to dispose of industrial waste at designated remote sites in exchange for substantial payments. The signature at the bottom belonged to Marcus Blackwood, listed as project coordinator. Celeste felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together. Marcus Blackwood had arranged for toxic waste to be buried on the land that would eventually become her property. 20 years later, his security company was using a fake checkpoint to keep people away from the contaminated site. But why now? What had changed that made them worry about discovery? She pulled out her laptop and started researching Meridian Chemical Corporation. What she found was a trail of environmental disasters, lawsuits, and government settlements spanning 3 decades. The company had been dissolved in 2019 following a major scandal involving contaminated groundwater near military installations. Several executives had been indicted, but Marcus Blackwood's name didn't appear in any of the court documents. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know where you are. Return the documents and walk away or face the consequences." Celeste's blood ran cold. She had paid cash for the room and used back roads to get here. How could they have tracked her so quickly? She grabbed her belongings and headed for the door, but stopped when she heard vehicles pulling into the parking lot. Through the window blinds, she could see 3 black SUVs surrounding the motel. Security personnel in protective gear were taking positions around the building. One of them was speaking into a radio while pointing directly at her room. There was no back exit from the motel room, and the window faced an open field with no cover. She was trapped. But as she watched the tactical team prepare to breach her door, she noticed something that gave her hope. One of the men was carrying a device that looked like a cell phone tracker. They had found her by following her phone signal. Celeste quickly removed the battery from her cell phone and shoved it under the mattress. Then she gathered Garrett's documents and climbed into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. The bathroom had a small window that opened onto the roof of an adjacent storage building. She could hear boots on gravel outside as the security team moved into position. Someone was trying the handle of her room door. In 30 seconds, they would realize she wasn't answering and break down the door. Celeste squeezed through the bathroom window onto the storage building roof, clutching the envelope containing 20 years of buried secrets. Below her, she could hear shouting as the security team discovered her empty room, but she was already climbing down the back of the storage building, using rain gutters and electrical conduits to reach the ground. In the distance, she could see the lights of a truck stop. If she could reach it without being seen, she might find help. But as she started running across the dark field, she realized that exposing this conspiracy would require more than just evidence. She was going to need allies. And in a world where the government could track cell phones and deploy tactical teams overnight, she wasn't sure who she could trust. Celeste reached the truck stop just as dawn broke across the New Mexico desert. Her clothes were torn from climbing fences, and her hands were scraped from crawling through brush. But she had escaped with Frank Garrett's evidence intact. She bought a prepaid cell phone from the convenience store and found a quiet corner booth in the attached diner. Her first call was to Dylan. When her son answered, his voice was thick with sleep and worry. "Mom, thank God. I've been calling your phone all night. Where are you?" Celeste closed her eyes, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dylan, I need you to listen carefully. Something has happened with the diner and I might not be home for a few days. I need you to stay with your Aunt Rebecca until this gets sorted out." "What kind of something?" "You're scaring me." She had dreamed of calling Dylan from their new restaurant, telling him about renovation plans and the future they would build together. Instead, she was a fugitive in a truck stop, explaining why their dreams had collapsed. There's a legal dispute over the property. Some people are claiming they own it, and I have to fight this through the courts. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Mom, this was all our money, wasn't it? Everything we saved. The question hit her harder than running through barbed wire. We're going to be okay. I just need some time to figure this out. I can help. I can research the company online, find information about property laws, anything you need. Celeste felt tears threatening. At 16, Dylan was already thinking like the partner she needed. Right now, the most important thing you can do is stay safe at your aunt's house. Don't talk to anyone about where I am or what I'm doing. After hanging up, she spread Frank Garrett's documents across the diner table. The evidence was damning, but she needed to understand exactly what kind of legal fight she was facing. The chemical disposal contracts showed a pattern of illegal dumping spanning several years, with Marcus Blackwood's signature appearing on dozens of authorization forms. What struck her most was a memo dated just 18 months ago. It discussed emerging liability concerns related to groundwater contamination near the disposal site. Several families in the area had filed lawsuits claiming their wells had been poisoned. The memo recommended immediate site security measures to prevent further discovery. That explained the checkpoint. Blackwood wasn't just covering up old crimes. He was actively trying to prevent new evidence from being found. But the families who had filed those lawsuits might be allies. If Celeste could find them, she would have proof that the contamination was ongoing and affecting real people. She used her new phone to search for recent environmental lawsuits in the area. What she found made her heart race. 3 families had filed suit against unknown parties for groundwater contamination, but their cases had been dismissed on procedural grounds. All 3 families had been represented by the same lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in environmental law. Celeste was about to call Chen's office when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Outside the truck stop, a black SUV had just pulled into the parking lot. 2 men in dark suits were getting out, scanning the area methodically. She grabbed Garrett's documents and headed for the back exit, but her phone buzzed with a text message. Ms. Morrison, this is Sarah Chen. We need to talk immediately. They know you have the evidence. Celeste slipped out the back door of the truck stop and ran toward a cluster of 18-wheelers parked for the night. She crouched between 2 trailers, her heart pounding as she watched the men in suits enter the diner where she had been sitting moments before. Her phone rang, and she answered Sarah Chen's call in a whisper. Ms. Morrison, my name is Sarah Chen. I represent the families affected by contamination near your property. A man named Frank Garrett contacted me this morning before he died. The world seemed to stop spinning. Frank is dead? Heart attack, according to the hospital. But he called me at 5 a.m., said he had given you evidence that could prove our case. He was terrified they would kill him before he could see justice done. Celeste pressed her back against the cold metal of the trailer, processing the news. Frank Garrett had survived 20 years of keeping dangerous secrets, only to die hours after handing them to her. How do I know you're really a lawyer? How do I know this isn't another trap? Because I'm about to tell you something that could get me disbarred. 3 of my clients' wells tested positive for the same chemicals Frank found in those barrels 20 years ago. The contamination is spreading, and it's making people sick. But every time I try to subpoena records or force disclosure, my cases get dismissed on technicalities. Technicalities? Judges who suddenly discover procedural errors, evidence that mysteriously disappears from court files, witnesses who change their testimony or simply vanish. Ms. Morrison, Marcus Blackwood has connections that reach into the courthouse itself. Celeste watched the men emerge from the diner, clearly frustrated that their target had escaped. One was speaking urgently into a phone, while the other checked license plates in the parking lot. If he's so powerful, how can we possibly win? Because you have legal title to the contaminated land. That gives you standing that my clients don't have. You can file for an environmental impact assessment. Demand soil testing. Force them to prove the land is safe. They can't dismiss your case on technicalities because you're the property owner. The men were getting closer to her hiding spot. Celeste could hear their footsteps on gravel as they systematically searched between vehicles. Where can we meet? Somewhere they can't track us. There's an abandoned gas station 12 miles north of Artesia on Route 285. Meet me there in 2 hours. And Ms. Morrison, bring everything Frank gave you. Those documents are the only proof we have that this conspiracy reaches the highest levels of government. One of the men was now just 2 trailers away, shining a flashlight under each vehicle. Celeste ended the call and crawled beneath the nearest 18-wheeler, pressing herself flat against the asphalt. Through the gap between dual wheels, she could see expensive dress shoes walking slowly past her hiding place. She held her breath for what felt like hours until the footsteps moved away. When she finally emerged from under the truck, the black SUV was gone. But as she started walking toward the highway to find new transportation, she realized that Frank Garrett's death had changed everything. This was no longer just about recovering her property or exposing environmental crimes. Someone was willing to commit murder to keep these secrets buried, and she was now the only person alive who could prove it. Sarah Chen was already waiting when Celeste arrived at the abandoned gas station. The lawyer was younger than Celeste had expected, maybe early 30s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She sat in a dusty Jeep Cherokee, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. "You look like you've been through hell," Chen said, as Celeste climbed into the passenger seat. "Frank told me you were tough, but I didn't realize you'd be running for your life." Celeste handed over the manila envelope. "Everything Frank collected is in here. Photos, lab reports, government contracts. It proves Marcus Blackwood orchestrated illegal chemical dumping on my land 20 years ago." Chen examined the documents carefully, her expression growing darker with each page. "This is even worse than I thought. Look at this disposal manifest. They buried enough industrial solvents to contaminate groundwater for 50 miles in every direction. My clients weren't random victims. They were living directly downstream from a toxic time bomb. Can we use this to get my property back? Better than that. We can use this to send Marcus Blackwood to federal prison and force a complete environmental cleanup. But we need to move fast. Frank's death wasn't natural, and you're next on their list." Chen pulled out her laptop and showed Celeste a detailed legal strategy. "I've been preparing for this moment for 3 years. We file an emergency environmental protection order in federal court tomorrow morning. The evidence you have proves imminent public health danger, which gives a federal judge authority to override any local corruption. What about the checkpoint? They're still blocking access to my land. That's the beautiful part. Federal environmental law trumps everything, including national security claims. Once we file this motion, Blackwood will have to prove his checkpoint serves a legitimate government purpose. Since it's really just covering up environmental crimes, he can't do that without confessing." Celeste felt hope stirring for the first time in days. "You really think this will work?" "I know it will work. But here's what's going to happen. The moment we file these papers, Blackwood will know his 20-year cover-up is over. He'll try to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, maybe even make us disappear. We need to get this story to the media simultaneously." Chen made several phone calls, speaking to contacts at environmental groups and investigative journalists. Within an hour, she had arranged for the story to break in 3 major newspapers the same day their court filing hit the system. "There's one more thing," Chen said as she finished her calls. "I've been in contact with 2 federal agents who have been investigating Blackwood for years. They couldn't move forward without evidence of ongoing crimes, but your property ownership gives them the legal opening they needed." As if summoned by her words, 2 unmarked sedans pulled into the gas station parking lot. 4 people in conservative business suits emerged, moving with the careful precision of federal law enforcement. The lead agent, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, approached their vehicle. "Ms. Morrison, I'm Special Agent Catherine Walsh, Environmental Crimes Unit. We've been waiting a long time to meet someone with legal standing to challenge Marcus Blackwood's operation." Celeste looked at the federal agents, then at Sarah Chen, then at Frank Garrett's evidence scattered across the dashboard. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into a federal courthouse and reclaim not just her property, but justice for everyone Blackwood had poisoned. But tonight, she realized, she needed to call Dylan and tell him they were going home. 3 months later, Celeste stood in front of her roadside diner, watching a crew of environmental specialists remove the last of the concrete barriers that had blocked her property. The federal court had moved with unprecedented speed once Agent Walsh presented Frank Garrett's evidence alongside testimony from Chen's poisoned clients. Marcus Blackwood's fake checkpoint had been dismantled within 72 hours of their emergency filing. Dylan helped carry renovation supplies from their truck to the diner's front door. Her son had grown up considerably during the legal battle, spending hours researching environmental law and supporting his mother through depositions and court hearings. The 16-year-old who had once dreamed of helping run a family restaurant had become a partner in something much more important. "Mom, look at this," Dylan called out, holding up a newspaper. The headline read, "Environmental criminal sentenced to 25 years. Below it was a photo of Marcus Blackwood in handcuffs, being led away from federal court after his conviction on charges of conspiracy, environmental destruction, and racketeering. The article detailed how Blackwood's security company had been a front for covering up decades of illegal waste disposal. Federal agents had found evidence linking him to contamination sites across 4 states, affecting hundreds of families. The judge had ordered complete environmental cleanup of all affected areas, funded by seizure of Blackwood's assets. 25 years, Celeste said, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried since that first day at the checkpoint. He'll never poison another family. Sarah Chen pulled up in her Jeep, accompanied by Agent Walsh and several other federal officials. They had become unlikely allies during the investigation, working together to unravel a conspiracy that reached much deeper than anyone had imagined. The final environmental report came back, Chen announced, holding up a thick folder. The contamination is completely contained within your property boundaries. With proper remediation, which the government is funding, this land will be safe for any use within 6 months. Agent Walsh nodded. Ms. Morrison, your decision to fight back instead of walking away led to the largest environmental crime prosecution in New Mexico history. 18 other families will receive compensation, and we've prevented future contamination across the region. Celeste looked at her son, then at the diner that had almost cost them everything. Dylan, what do you think? Still want to run a restaurant? Her son grinned, the same expression he had worn when she first told him about buying the property. I think we should serve the best green chili cheeseburgers in the state, and maybe put up a memorial for Frank Garrett somewhere on the property. 3 months later, Morrison's Desert Diner opened its doors for the first time in decades. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks, motorcycles, and family cars. Local news crews filmed the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but Celeste barely noticed the cameras. She was too busy watching Dylan take an order from their first customer, a rancher who lived 20 miles down the highway. That evening, as they cleaned up after their successful opening day, Dylan found an envelope that someone had slipped under the door. Inside was a brief note. Frank would be proud. His sacrifice meant something. Thank you for not giving up. Celeste folded the note carefully and put it in the cash register. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in months, she and Dylan were exactly where they belonged. In their own place, built with their own hands, on land that truly belonged to them. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination triumph against impossible odds. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.